My child, pause here for a moment, because what you are about to hear was meant to find you when your heart was finally quiet enough to recognize it. Do not rush past this moment as though it were ordinary. Something has been sitting in the silence between you and the person your heart still remembers, something that was written long before courage was strong enough to deliver it. There is a letter. Not merely a collection of beautiful words, not merely a confession made in a passing wave of emotion, but a private pouring out of everything this person has struggled to say aloud. They wrote what they could not speak. They admitted what pride kept hidden. They placed into words the feelings they kept carrying when no one else was watching. And the most surprising part is not that the letter exists. The most surprising part is what they finally allowed themselves to reveal inside it. You may have wondered why certain memories have been returning to you without invitation. You may have noticed that moments you thought you had made peace with suddenly feel close again, as though something unfinished is gently knocking on the door of your awareness. Perhaps a familiar song stirred something you could not explain. Perhaps you woke from a dream carrying an emotion that did not belong to the dream itself. Perhaps their name crossed your mind at an unusual moment, and instead of disappearing quickly, it lingered. Do not force a meaning onto any of these things, beloved. This is a story of the heart, not a prediction carved into stone. But within this story, heaven is showing you something important. Sometimes the deepest truths remain unspoken not because they are absent, but because someone does not yet know how to hold the weight of saying them. Your soulmate has been carrying that weight. In the quiet of this story, they sat alone with a blank page before them, telling themselves they would write only a few sentences. Nothing dramatic. Nothing too vulnerable. Nothing that could expose how much you still mattered. They believed they could control the words. But once they began, the truth moved faster than their defenses. One sentence became another. Then another. And before long, they were writing things they had never admitted even to themselves. They paused more than once. They almost tore the page. They almost deleted the message. They almost convinced themselves that silence would be safer. But something within them refused to let them keep running from what their heart already knew. The first confession in that letter was simple, yet it frightened them. I still think about you more than I should. They stared at those words for a long time because they knew they were not complete. Thinking about you was not the whole truth. You had become woven into places inside them they had tried desperately to reorganize. They could change their routine, distract themselves, speak with other people, fill their days with noise, and still something would bring them back to the same emotional doorway. It was not always romance that returned first. Sometimes it was your kindness. Sometimes your patience. Sometimes a conversation they did not appreciate enough when it happened. Sometimes it was the way you noticed something was wrong before they ever admitted it. Those were the memories that unsettled them most, because they were beginning to understand that what they missed was not merely attention. They missed being known. And that is where the letter became more honest. They wrote that they had underestimated what your presence meant to them. They admitted that there were moments when they treated something precious as though it would always be available. They assumed there would be another conversation, another opportunity, another perfect moment to explain themselves. They thought time would patiently wait while they figured out what they wanted. But time has a strange way of revealing value through distance. Once the familiar comfort of your presence was no longer guaranteed, they began noticing the emptiness where certain little things used to be. The silence after something funny happened and there was no message sent to you. The instinct to share a thought before remembering that things had changed. The urge to ask how you were, followed by a hesitation they could not overcome. These tiny moments accumulated until they could no longer pretend their feelings were shallow. Beloved, stay with this, because the letter did not remain a love confession for long. It became an apology. Your soulmate wrote about a moment that still troubles them. Maybe you remember it differently. Maybe you do not even realize how significant it became in their mind. But there was a time when you needed reassurance, honesty, consistency, or simply the courage of their presence, and they gave you less than they knew you deserved. They told themselves they were confused. They told themselves they needed space. They told themselves they did not want to make promises before they were ready. Some of those reasons may even have been true. But beneath all of them was something harder to admit. They were afraid of being fully seen by someone whose opinion mattered deeply. You awakened vulnerability in them, and vulnerability felt dangerous. They could handle admiration. They could handle attraction. They could handle relationships that stayed comfortably on the surface. But you noticed the pieces they had spent years learning to disguise. You could hear the change in their voice. You could sense when confidence was covering fear. You could recognize when their silence was saying more than their words. At first, they loved this. Then it frightened them. Because to be known so deeply means losing the illusion that you can always hide behind the version of yourself you present to everyone else. So they pulled away from the very thing their heart had been asking for. And now they finally understand the contradiction. In the letter, they wrote something they never expected to write: I was not afraid that you would hurt me. I was afraid that you would love me enough to make me face myself. Those words stopped them. They read them once. Then again. They almost erased them. But they did not, because for the first time they recognized the truth underneath so many choices they had struggled to explain. Your presence had become a mirror. Not a cruel mirror. Not a judgmental one. A clear one. Around you, they became aware of how often they avoided difficult conversations, how quickly they defended themselves when ashamed, how easily they mistook emotional distance for strength. They began noticing patterns they had inherited from old disappointments. They remembered promises they once made to themselves about never needing anyone too much. They remembered the moments when love had been used carelessly around them, and they realized they had built walls so early that they forgot those walls were originally meant to be temporary. You did not create those walls. You simply became the person whose presence made them notice how lonely it had become behind them. But there is another confession in the letter, and this is where the story shifts. They admitted that they tried to convince themselves that what they felt for you would fade. They expected distance to make everything simpler. They thought the mind would eventually overrule the heart. So they waited. Days became weeks. Weeks became longer seasons. Life continued. Responsibilities demanded attention. They smiled. They functioned. They kept moving. Yet instead of fading, their understanding of you became clearer. They began separating what was real from what was fear. They realized that some of the things they once called problems were actually opportunities to grow. They saw that certain disagreements were not proof that the connection was wrong, they were moments when two imperfect people were trying to be understood. They recognized that your boundaries were not rejection. Your questions were not attacks. Your desire for clarity was not pressure. Much of what they resisted came from their own fear that love would require them to become more emotionally honest than they had ever been. And now, with enough distance to look back differently, they can see the places where you were not asking for perfection. You were asking for presence. That realization is written in the letter with a kind of quiet regret that cannot be manufactured. They remember occasions when you waited for an answer that should not have been difficult to give. They remember moments when you offered tenderness and received uncertainty. They remember how many times you tried to understand their perspective even while your own heart was hurting. And they finally wrote the words you may once have wished to hear: you were not asking too much. I was giving too little because I was afraid of what giving more would require of me. But beloved, do not mistake this story for an instruction to abandon your boundaries. Love is not measured by how long you wait for another person to change. Compassion does not require self-abandonment. A beautiful confession is meaningful only when actions become capable of carrying the truth those words declare. Heaven is not teaching you to chase what continually wounds you. Heaven is inviting you to see clearly. Another person's awakening can be real without becoming your responsibility. That distinction matters because the next part of the letter is not about asking you to rescue them. It is about what they now want to change within themselves. They wrote that losing certainty about you forced them to question the person they had become. Not because you were perfect, and not because they believed they must transform into someone else just to earn affection, but because they finally recognized where fear had been controlling their life. They saw how many conversations they had avoided. They noticed how pride made simple apologies unnecessarily difficult. They saw how often they waited for the other person to make the first move because being the first to care felt like surrendering power. And then they asked themselves a question that changed the direction of the entire letter: what if love was never supposed to be about who has more power? For a long time, they believed the person who cared less was safer. The person who answered later was safer. The person who stayed emotionally unpredictable could not easily be hurt. Somewhere along the way, protection became distance, and distance became habit. But the heart does not thrive on strategies designed to prevent pain. It thrives on honesty, mutual respect, courage, and presence. Your soulmate is beginning to understand that now. They admitted that there were moments when they watched you become quieter, and instead of asking what was happening inside you, they told themselves you were losing interest. They saw your exhaustion and mistook it for indifference. They noticed your boundaries and assumed you were trying to punish them. Only later did they understand that perhaps you were simply tired of translating your heart to someone who kept pretending not to understand the language. That sentence hurt them to write. Because there were signs. There were moments when your energy changed. Moments when you stopped explaining. moments when you no longer fought to be heard. And although they may not have said anything then, they noticed. They remember the first time they sensed you becoming emotionally distant. It unsettled them more than any argument ever had, because arguments still carried passion. Silence carried possibility, the possibility that you were learning how to live without the answer you once desperately wanted from them. This is the part of the letter where the handwriting changes. The words become less controlled. The sentences become more vulnerable. The person who began writing with caution is no longer hiding behind careful phrases. They write about missing you. Not vaguely. Not romantically in some polished, poetic way. They describe the strange details. The expression on your face when you were trying not to laugh. The way you remembered things they casually mentioned. A phrase you often used. The sound of your voice when you were tired. The way conversations with you sometimes made time disappear. They even wrote about a memory you might not expect them to remember. A small moment. Nothing cinematic happened. No dramatic confession. No grand gesture. Perhaps you were sitting somewhere ordinary, talking about something completely unrelated to love. Yet for a few seconds, they looked at you and experienced a feeling they could not name at the time. It was calm. Almost frighteningly calm. The thought crossed their mind, I could imagine this person being part of my life for a very long time. They buried the thought immediately. They never told you. But they remembered it while writing the letter. And now they understand why that quiet moment scared them more than intense attraction ever could. Attraction is easy to dismiss. A sense of home is not. Beloved, there are people who spend years searching for excitement because excitement asks nothing permanent from them. But peace can feel terrifying to a heart accustomed to uncertainty. When someone has lived through emotional instability, healthy affection can sometimes feel unfamiliar. They may mistake calm for boredom. Consistency for pressure. Intimacy for danger. They may not realize until later that the very thing they resisted was the safety they always claimed to want. Your soulmate writes about this realization with painful clarity. They say, I thought love was supposed to feel like constant uncertainty because that was what I knew. With you, there were moments when everything became quiet inside me. I did not know how to trust that. Then comes the revelation that may surprise you most. The letter was not written because they suddenly became certain you would return. It was written because they finally accepted that you might not. That possibility changed everything. As long as they believed you would always remain emotionally nearby, there was no urgency to confront themselves. They could postpone honesty. They could wait for a better day. They could imagine that eventually circumstances would align and everything unfinished would still be waiting patiently for them. But somewhere recently, something shifted. They began to understand that your life is moving. You are growing in ways they do not fully know. You are discovering boundaries they may never have expected you to develop. Perhaps you are becoming more peaceful with questions that once kept you awake. Perhaps you are realizing that your worth cannot depend upon another person finally recognizing it. Perhaps the version of you they assumed would always be waiting no longer exists. And instead of making them angry, that realization humbled them. They wrote, "If you have found peace without me, I do not want to disturb it just to ease my guilt." Beloved, notice the maturity hidden inside those words. This is not the voice of possession. This is not someone declaring that destiny gives them ownership over your choices. This is someone beginning to understand that love, if it is genuine, must respect the freedom of the person loved. Yet there is still something they want you to know. Something they believe they owe you regardless of what happens next. They want you to know that you mattered. Not because they were lonely. Not because another connection disappointed them. Not because they suddenly became nostalgic. You mattered while they were too confused to express it. You mattered while they acted detached. You mattered in the spaces between conversations. You mattered in the moments when fear was louder than courage. They wrote that there were several times they almost told you. One night, they opened your conversation and stared at your name for longer than they want to admit. They typed something, erased it, typed again, then closed the screen. Another time, something happened in their life and you were the first person they wanted to call. Their hand almost moved automatically. Then reality caught up with them, and they stopped. There was even a moment when they rehearsed an entire conversation with you in their mind. How they would begin. What they would apologize for. What they hoped you would say. They imagined you asking the question they feared most: why did it take you so long? And they had no answer that sounded good enough. Because the truth is rarely impressive. Sometimes the truth is simply, I was afraid. Afraid you would reject them. Afraid you had already changed your mind. Afraid they had waited too long. Afraid that hearing your voice would bring back emotions they had barely learned how to contain. Afraid that you would listen quietly and then tell them the chapter had already closed. So instead of risking an answer, they kept carrying the question. But the letter changed that. The letter gave them somewhere to place all the sentences that had nowhere else to go. And as they wrote, the confession became deeper than, I miss you. They admitted something about jealousy, not the controlling kind, but the quiet sting that appeared when they imagined someone else receiving the version of you they once took for granted. Someone else hearing your laugh after a long day. Someone else being trusted with your dreams. Someone else learning the little things about you that they once assumed they would always have time to discover. That thought exposed them. Because suddenly they understood that postponing love has consequences. Life does not freeze while someone decides whether they are brave enough. And yet, beloved, heaven whispers a gentle warning into this story: do not let another person's regret become pressure upon your heart. You are allowed to care and still move carefully. You are allowed to forgive and still require consistency. You are allowed to hear beautiful words and wait for reality to confirm them. True love does not rush your discernment. What is sincere can withstand clarity. Your soulmate seems to understand this now too. In the letter, they do not demand another chance. They ask for the opportunity to be honest. There is a difference. They write, I cannot ask you to forget what hurt you. I cannot ask you to become who you were before. I only hope that one day you know what I should have said when I had the chance. And then comes a line they struggled with more than any other. They crossed it out. Wrote something else. Crossed that out too. Finally, they returned to the original words. I loved you before I knew what to do with love. They sat with that sentence. Because suddenly so many memories changed shape. The mixed signals. The hesitation. The intensity followed by distance. The moments of closeness that seemed to frighten them afterward. None of it becomes acceptable merely because fear was involved, but it becomes understandable in a way they could never explain before. They had feelings without emotional tools. Attachment without courage. Desire without clarity. And rather than admit they did not know how to navigate something important, they tried to control it. Now they understand that controlling love often destroys the very safety people are trying to protect. The letter continues. They begin describing what they would do differently, not making impossible promises, not claiming they would suddenly become perfect, but naming specific things. They would answer difficult questions instead of disappearing. They would speak before resentment grew. They would stop making you guess where you stood. They would tell you when they were afraid instead of disguising fear as indifference. They would listen without preparing a defense. They would apologize without trying to explain the apology away. They would allow love to be a partnership instead of a test. And then, unexpectedly, they write about your strength. Not the obvious kind. Not achievements. Not how well you hold yourself together. They write about the strength it took for you to remain soft-hearted after disappointment. They noticed it. Perhaps not soon enough. But they noticed. They saw how easily you could have become cruel after feeling misunderstood, yet part of you kept choosing compassion. They remember moments when you had every reason to respond harshly and instead chose restraint. They remember how you continued hoping for the best in them longer than they deserved. And in the letter, they say something that carries more weight than all the romantic words before it. I hope you never mistake my inability to value your heart properly for evidence that your heart was not valuable. That sentence is not only for the story. It is for you. Because sometimes we carry another person's limitations as though they were verdicts about our worth. We wonder why we were not enough to make them choose differently. Why our love did not change them. Why patience did not create courage. Why sincerity did not guarantee reciprocity. But another person's readiness is not a measurement of your value. Sometimes people meet something beautiful while they are still learning how not to run from beauty. And sometimes they understand only after distance teaches what closeness could not. There is something else in the letter that they have not been able to finish. Every time they reach that paragraph, they stop. Because this part is not about the past. It is about what they hope happens next. They begin the sentence, if I ever get the chance to speak to you again. Then nothing. The words disappear. The page remains unfinished. Why? Because imagining the conversation makes everything real. Writing about memories is safe. Memories cannot interrupt. Memories cannot say no. Memories cannot look back at you with eyes that have changed. But the future is different. The future requires courage. Your soulmate knows that if they ever place this truth before you, they must be prepared for whatever truth you place before them. Maybe you would still care. Maybe you would need time. Maybe you would forgive them but choose a different path. Maybe the conversation would reopen something beautiful. Maybe it would finally close something peacefully. They do not know. And for perhaps the first time, they are learning that love cannot be controlled by predicting the answer. It can only be offered honestly. So they return to the letter tonight, or within the symbolic world of this message, in one of those quiet hours when every distraction finally disappeared, and they wrote another paragraph. This one begins differently. No matter what you decide, thank you. Thank you for loving them when they did not know how to receive it. Thank you for revealing places inside them that needed healing. Thank you for teaching them that connection without honesty eventually becomes confusion. Thank you for showing them the difference between someone wanting their attention and someone caring about their soul. And then, beloved, they wrote the sentence that changed the entire meaning of the letter. I thought I was writing this to ask for another chance, but I realize I am writing it because you deserve the truth. That is where the hidden letter becomes something bigger than a romantic confession. It becomes an act of accountability. Because love that only speaks when it wants something in return is still negotiating. But truth offered without demanding an outcome carries a different energy. They are beginning to understand that if they truly care for you, they must be willing to honor your response, even if it is not the answer they secretly hope for. And yet, there is one final secret they have not written clearly. They keep circling around it. Every other confession seems to lead toward it. They mentioned the memory of looking at you and imagining a future. They admitted they loved you before they understood love. They acknowledged that losing you became a possibility they could no longer ignore. But there is a deeper truth underneath all of those admissions. Something they have never said to anyone. Something connected to a decision they once made when you knew nothing about what was happening inside them. They thought that decision was protecting both of you. Now they believe it may have been the very choice that created the distance between you. The letter contains a sentence about it, but the sentence is unfinished. It reads, "The real reason I stepped away was not because I stopped feeling something for you. I stepped away because I found out." And then the words stop. The pen lifts from the page. The room goes silent. Because what comes next is the one truth they have been most afraid to reveal, and once it is written, neither of you will ever look at the past in quite the same way again.